Okay, third and last video. This one is on Federalist number 51. And 51 and 10 work together. You could almost take them as one piece. In 10, as we just saw, Madison is talking about representation and the benefits of an extended republic compared to a pure democracy, and how that allows a system of representation where a few better, more virtuous leaders can be chosen by the masses and the rest of us to do the day-to-day governing, and how an extended republic takes into account far more territory and more interests and diverse religions, economic classes, cultures, and that breaking up the society into all of these parts is a good thing because there's a certain checking and balancing in society among groups. In 51, he's talking about the structure of the government, and he's talking specifically about the separation of powers and checks and balances. So this is the governmental structure that overlays the extended republic and the idea of representation in that republic, and filters and refines and breaks up and processes the inputs that come from society. If you were being sharp and critical, you might think when you read the first sentence of Federalist 51 that you were coming in the middle of an argument, and you'd be correct. It is the middle of an argument. In Federalist 47, 48, 49, 50, four separate papers, Madison has been discussing the problem of the separation of powers. And for Madison, a key term throughout the Federalist Papers is parchment barriers. Parchment is paper, and the insight here is acute. It will not do, he says, to write down the powers that institutions have and expect the people in those institutions to stay in their lanes and obey the written down rules about what they can do and what they can't do. Power for Madison, and he's right about this, power is of an encroaching nature. He says power always wants more power, and you can't just write a rule book and expect people to follow it. That's not going to work. And he's been, in the prior papers, 47, 48, 49, 50, he's been, playing with this problem and considering different ways of handling it. The problem of maybe one branch swallowing up and dominating the other two, because separation of powers and not having all power accumulate in a single set of hands, that's a vital part of Republican government. Separation of, most people would define Republican government at least to include elections and electoral accountability and the separation of powers, and people would add sort of rule of law and courts and sort of the maintenance of the rule of law as well. But if you don't have the separation of powers, you don't have a Republican form of government. How do you make sure that separation of powers remains the separation of powers? And he's been canvassing different ways of dealing with this. One of the more interesting things he's talked about and rejected is a Jeffersonian notion. Jefferson had already written that if there's a dispute between, say, the executive and the legislative branches about who has the power to do what or what should be done, Jefferson would say, well, everyone should go to the people and let the people decide. That's Republican. Madison rejects that. He says we want the people to make fundamental decisions about their government occasionally, but not on an ongoing basis. It'll be too disruptive, too destabilizing. So the opening line in Federalist 51 is, to what expedient, what method, what approach, then shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments, and by departments he means branches of government, as laid down in the Constitution. because I've shown you all of these external controls, parchment barriers, appeals to the people, won't work, then we have to actually account for this by how we formulate the interior structure of government, how we organize the governing institutions to interact with each other. Um, they have to be organized to keep each other in their proper places. Um, and then another basic point from which the argument in 51 proceeds is that in a Republican government, you don't have three equally powerful branches of government. Far from it. Because it's a Republican government, because popular sovereignty in some sense is unquestioned, um, the legislative branch is going to be the one that's most dangerous because it will have the most power, it will have the most legitimacy, it will have the most support. It is and must be the representative body, where representation is vital, and the lawmaking body, because that's why it's there. That renders it dangerous in terms of power. And next is the president, because obviously executive authority can be quite dangerous. And then next is the courts. So in the Federalist Papers, institutional design is designed to counterbalance against all of that. Right? They're not all equally threatening. The legislative branch is actually the most threatening branch in terms of taking over the other two and maybe tyrannizing over the society. So what's the first move to deal with the most dangerous branch? And this is something that, again, is hardwired. We don't have to go with it. We could dispense with it, but it's called bicameralism. If this branch is the most powerful, why don't we break it in two and constitute two legislative bodies, both of which will have power, neither of which will determine the membership or powers of the other, and both of which will have to concur, both will have to say yes to the exact same laws before they could possibly become law. All right, so bicameralism, having a House and a Senate, is the key move here, and it's done so that they can check each other, right? Right. And I think you should look at paragraph 4 in Federalist 51. You have to give each branch power, and then the ways to check the other branches. So bicameralism is his first move, right? The branch closest to the people will be a House and a Senate. And then he goes on to talk about the check on the legislative branch as a whole. So let's say that that the House and the Senate do agree on something. Does that become law? No. You need the president's approval. And he even talks about how the framers, and they did, consider an absolute veto, which would mean House and Senate pass a law. If the president says no, then it's no. And that's the end of it. But instead of that, because that puts maybe too much power in one person's hands, they gave the president a qualified veto, which is still a very, very strong negative force. Right? So the president can veto the law, and then that veto would have to be overridden by a 2/3 vote in each of the two separate houses of the legislative branch. So he's defending this, right, in this language, this policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives, right? We could trace through all of human affairs, right? So you can't rely on virtue, you can't rely on reason. You've got to set up these different institutions which represent and speak for and act on behalf of different constituencies to check and balance each other. And bicameralism, I will learn how to say that word someday, bicameralism is itself a checking and balancing device. what would happen if we got rid of it? What if we just had a legislative assembly with representation by population by states, and that's it? Do we need a second branch? One state has one house, Nebraska. Nobody lives in Nebraska. But Nebraska has a one house legislative body, and the world hasn't come to an end. Maybe if we wanted to get more things done more quickly, we could have unicameralism, one house. So there he's talking about the legislative branch being the most dangerous because it's closest to the people. That necessitates the presidential veto. And then he goes on at the end of the essay to really return to two subpoints that take us back to Federalist 10, right? And here he's making 2 points. One is about federalism, and one returns to Federalist 10's point about the extent of the territory. And this is an important point to consider about the framework that they set up, and it is still with us. It still operates in this way, by the way. But he says we are not dispensing with a federal republic. The Articles of Confederation were set up a federation where the states had more power than the national government. This new constitution places much more power in the hands of the national government compared to the states, but it doesn't obliterate the states as separate and independent sovereigns. So every state has a constitution, and every state has 3 branches of government, and every state has its own system of checks and balances. But state systems and the federal system check and balance each other. He calls this the compound republic, not the unitary republic or single republic. It's a compound republic, partly national, partly federal. One nation in some ways, but a nation of several states in other ways. And it is true throughout our history that interests and values that lose out on one level tend to migrate to the other level to pursue their values and interests. You think of liberal states that are resisting the national immigration enforcement policies with sanctuary cities or sanctuary states these days, or states that innovate in social welfare policy when measures can't be passed at the national level, or national majorities overriding sectional state interests during the civil rights movement. So there is a kind of a checking and balancing that occurs between the different levels of government as well, each level having separation of powers within it. And then the second point he makes, he just returns to Federalist 10, and it just reiterates the theme there, that in a vast territory with many diverse parties and interests, he says society will be broken up into so many parts that no interested and overbearing factious majority could form and take over. And that guards against what he's fearing. At the end, I highlighted at the end of the essay, at the end of Federalist 51, this little line about Rhode Island. Like, Rhode Island didn't send anyone to the Constitutional Convention. They were the last to join the Union. Very small compass, localist, democratic. Before the convention, Rhode Island had passed a debtor relief legislation, and this bothered Madison a lot because the majority in Rhode Island used the power of government to favor the majority but take away the property rights of the creditor class. He thought this, not without some justification, he thought this was a violation of the natural rights of the people who lent the other people money, right? So he writes, it can be little doubted that if the state of Rhode Island were separated from the Confederacy and left to itself, the insecurity of rights under the popular form of government within such narrow limits would be displayed by such reiterated oppressions of factious majorities that some power altogether independent of the people would soon be called for by a voice of the people, right? The voice of the very factions whose misrule had proved the necessity of it. In the extended Republic of the United States, the great variety of interest in parties and sects which it embraces, you would not get a coalition of a tyrannical majority. And there's a point here that if things get things disintegrate far enough, and there's factious majorities oppressing minorities, you could have degeneration into conflict and violence. Degeneration into conflict and violence does often call forth a willingness to have some strong man who can take over and restore order and save everybody. So you do have a threat to Republican government in that envisioned process of misrule. Well, you have to make some decisions about human nature, about the constitutional framework, about our historical veneration of something that we take for granted probably more than we should. You know, I'm with the critics on this one. There's a guy at UT Austin, a political scientist, and he's also a lawyer, law degree, PhD in political science, named Sanford Levinson, who's written 3 books in the last 10 years that tries to unstick our assumptions and our veneration for these structures that he argues are not nearly democratic enough. It's risky. You know, the Madisonian system keeps functioning to correct extremism and bring us back to some middle, and it does that historically. So if you're a liberal or you're on the left, you have a love-hate relationship with Madison. That maybe the system prevents the worst kinds of things, even if it has these defects with respect to actually getting anything done, or actually often even remotely reflecting the will of the majority. But this is what I'm going to ask you to handle. I'm going to ask you to handle the anti-federalist, federalist debate, and think broadly about how democratic is the Constitution. It could be plenty democratic enough in a complicated way, because the people do play a role. It could be, you know, anti-democratic in some ways, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. You could say it's a good thing. Or you could say it's a bad thing, and we need to think harder about these structural features that make it really hard for any majority to work its will easily, simply in a short period of time. And another aspect of the system, your textbook authors, Jim Morone and his co-author, remark upon this. It's so hard to get anything major done that usually there's sort of a build-up, kind of a pressure cooker period of time, and then there's this explosion of reform, and then it's really hard to undo those things after they take hold and they become institutionalized and embedded. So the 1930s were such a moment where there was this pent-up need for reform and, you know, social welfare legislation, economic regulation, things we needed to do, and with other countries around the world sort of disintegrating into chaos or fascism, you get these explosions of reform, but then it then becomes really hard to make any major changes for generations, right? And that's a feature of the system. It's very hard to get anything done. Does that give us better government over the long run? There are lots of other modern issues today that aren't relevant to this particular conversation: campaign finance, gerrymandering. You know, there are lots of things we need to talk about if we want to talk about the quality of our democracy, and we will. But for now, we'll leave it there, and I'll leave you to think about this. At the very least, you know, I want you to be able to give a very good and detailed description of the constitutional framework, and to think about why all this complexity, why this vast sort of complicated structures, and are those defensible or not? Okay, thanks.